They said love songs were forever. But forever, as Nicole Kidman learned, is often shorter than the echo that follows it. The world saw perfection, a woman of glass and fire, hand in hand with a country star whose melodies seemed carved from devotion itself. Nashville loved them. Hollywood adored them. Together, they looked like a hymn the world could believe in. But time has a way of peeling back the gold leaf on any fairy tale. Beneath the photographs and awards were nights that didn't sing, silences that roared louder than applause. Nicole, the queen of composure, learned how to keep smiling even as her reflection began to fade behind him. And then, after 19 years, the silence broke. The divorce filing was not a scandal. It was a declaration of truth, not vengeance, of air, not ashes. The media asked, "What did he do?" Nicole answered only, "I finally remembered who I was before the songs." Her voice didn't tremble. It never does. But there was something new, the kind of calm that comes after fire, the kind of freedom that no diamond can buy. The headline screamed betrayal, heartbreak, exposure. But the truth she offered wasn't tabloid ink. It was blood and memory, the story of how a woman built from light can still be shadowed by love. And now she steps forward, not to accuse, but to reveal, not to destroy, but to define. Because the real secret isn't what Keith Urban did, it's what Nicole Kidman survived. Before the cameras, before the red carpets, before the quiet wars of marriage and fame, there was a small girl running barefoot along the sun-baked edges of Sydney's suburbs. Her name was Nicole Mary Kidman. Her hair was the color of wild flame, her skin a map of light so pale that the sun seemed to chase her, just to leave a mark. Her father, Anthony, was a psychologist, gentle, thoughtful, always measuring the invisible storms that lived in people's minds. Her mother, Janelle, worked as a nurse and a feminist advocate, a woman who carried both compassion and rebellion like two hands of the same heart. From them, Nicole learned two lessons that would rule her life. Empathy can heal, but silence can kill. She was shy, awkward, painfully tall for her age. The other children teased her for her height, her accent, her nervous way of twisting her fingers when she spoke. But even then, there was something unbreakable about her, a strange electricity that seemed to live behind her quiet eyes. She didn't fight back with words, she waited for the stage. When she discovered acting, it was like breathing for the first time. The local theater smelled of dust and dreams, and when she stepped beneath its cheap lights, something inside her clicked into place. She could disappear into someone else's pain, someone else's joy, and in doing so, she learned how to survive her own. Her father once told her, "People think strength means never breaking, but strength is learning how to rebuild." She would carry that sentence like a prayer through every heartbreak of her life. In her teenage years, she was already marked by that strange contradiction, fragile yet fierce, introspective yet hungry for the world. She devoured books, scribbled notes in journals, and practiced lines in front of a mirror that reflected not vanity, but purpose. Her eyes didn't dream of stardom. They dreamed of transformation, of becoming someone whose truth could reach others through art. At 17, while her classmates worried about exams, Nicole auditioned for Bush Christmas. The film was small, simple, but for her it was the doorway to destiny. Her face, that porcelain flame, caught the attention of directors far beyond Australia's borders. But what none of them could see was the deeper hunger behind it, the need to matter, the need to prove that the quiet girl from Sydney could speak loud enough to echo across oceans. Fame did not tempt her then. What tempted her was escape, from self-doubt, from loneliness, from the echo of every cruel laugh that once told her she wasn't enough. Acting gave her a weapon, but also a wound. She would spend years giving her soul to characters and forgetting how to keep some for herself. In an early interview, barely 20, she was asked what she feared most. She smiled, shy but certain, becoming invisible. That fear of fading, of being swallowed by someone else's story, would follow her through decades of triumph and tragedy. It would follow her into marriages that promised eternity but delivered only endurance. It would whisper to her on nights when applause felt hollow, when the woman everyone saw didn't match the one she knew. Yet, in those early years, Nicole still believed in goodness. She still believed that love was a shelter, not a mirror. She believed that being kind could protect you. But the world she was stepping into, glittering, merciless, intoxicating, had no patience for gentle hearts. By 21, Hollywood called. She packed her life into a suitcase and boarded a plane alone. The engines roared, and she looked out the window as her childhood dissolved beneath the clouds. She didn't know it then, but that flight was more than a beginning. It was a farewell, not just to Australia, but to innocence itself. The girl who left Sydney would never return. The woman who landed in Los Angeles would learn what it means to shine and to burn. Los Angeles did not greet her with roses. It greeted her with rooms that measured beauty like currency and confidence like oxygen. Nicole had one, but not always the other. The city asked for certainty. She offered precision. Casting directors flipped through headshots as if skimming a magazine they did not intend to buy. Still, she waited with the patience she had learned in the wings of school theaters. If you cannot force the door, become the key. Work arrived not as thunder, but as weather. First a breeze, then a change in pressure. Dead calm tilted everything. In that boat on the open water, she found the camera's hunger and fed it with stillness. Fear on her face looked like mathematics, exact and unshowy. Resolve looked like a candle that refuses to be blown out. Audiences didn't just notice her, they leaned toward her, as if listening to a secret pronounced without sound. Hollywood began to test her edges. Could she be fragile? Yes. Could she be dangerous? Also yes. But what startled them was how she could be both in the same breath. She moved through genres the way a dancer moves through rooms, never tripping over thresholds. From thriller to romance, from prestige to pulp. Each role a rung in an invisible ladder she climbed without looking down. Then came the kind of romance that alters maps. Meeting Tom Cruise was like stepping into a wind tunnel of attention, cameras, headlines, expectations. Love, fierce and glamorous, braided itself with career strategy, without her permission. Together, they were cinematic geometry, lines converging, light bending. She learned the choreography of double stardom, how to smile while flashbulbs stitched lightning across the night, how to disappear into someone else's fame without losing your place on set the next morning. Marriage taught her paradoxes. Security can feel like a stage set, solid until someone pushes too hard. Intimacy can be a magnifying glass that also burns. She kept working because the work kept her honest. On set, she could name her feelings by other names and survive them. Off-set, life was a tighter script with fewer rewrites. Roles multiplied. To Die For sharpened her into the kind of blade that cuts without bleeding. Critics who had called her a beauty began calling her an actor. Moulin Rouge showed a brand of luminosity that did not apologize for its own wattage. She sang like someone bargaining with fate and loved like someone who knows time is a creditor that always collects. And then The Others, a haunted house where the ghosts were not merely in the wallpaper, but in the human capacity for denial. Each project layered muscle over bone, craft over instinct, until the old insecurity about becoming invisible began to look almost quaint. She was still young, but the industry had made her older. Older in caution, older in calculation, and older in the private ways a woman must become clever simply to remain herself. And then came the role that would re-sculpt her name, The Hours. Playing Virginia Woolf was not about costume or accent. It was about entering a mind where beauty and despair court each other like rain and sea. Nicole wore a nose, famously, but what she wore more bravely was weariness, an exhaustion of the spirit that looked nothing like weakness and everything like truth. The award that followed felt less like a crown than a mirror finally angled correctly. Success rearranged her solitude. People mistook ubiquity for intimacy. They knew her walk, her gowns, her interviews, yet fewer knew the quiet rituals that kept her whole. The pre-dawn tea, the notebooks, the way she would read a script aloud to hear where it broke. She learned to guard the small rooms inside herself where the world could not trespass. It was not secrecy, it was survival. There were missteps too, as all rises require. Films that missed their mark, choices that looked strategic on Monday and naive by Friday. Hollywood loves a narrative arc, and it tried to assign her one. Ingenue to wife to serious actress to something else that could be labeled and sold. But Nicole refused the convenience of a single story. Each time a box appeared, she walked around it, studying the grain of the wood, then used it as a step. Critics debated her mystery. Was it chill or control, distance or elegance? She knew the answer. It was concentration, the kind athletes cultivate, the kind chefs and surgeons and concert pianists know by other names. She understood that the camera rewards attention the way a garden rewards water. She gave it both. The rise was not merely vertical, it widened her, taught her dialects of courage. She learned the courage to say yes before the world approved, and later the courage to say no after it did. She learned the cost of public love and the price of private grief. She learned how to hold grace like a shield without turning it into armor that would keep tenderness out. When photographers shouted questions about her marriage, she answered with work. When they shouted louder, she answered with better work. That was the agreement she made with herself. Let your craft be your argument, and your silence be your signature. It wasn't martyrdom, it was methodology. And yet for all the triumph, a suspicion followed her like a low cloud, that the very gift that let her disappear into other lives might tempt her to erase her own. She could vanish so completely into a character that the woman wearing the costume sometimes forgot which seams belonged to whom. Fame, she discovered, is simply a mirror that multiplies. It will not tell you who you are, only how many angles you can be seen from. The ascent carried her past the gravity of expectation, into a thin air where only a few can breathe easily. From that altitude, the world gleamed, but voices distorted. Advice came disguised as affection. Affection came braided with agenda. She circled the noise and kept moving. The shy girl from Sydney had not vanished, she had become an engine. By the time the industry decided she belonged among its architects, she had already begun drawing new rooms, spaces for risk, for directors who needed her certainty to build their uncertainty, for scripts that asked her to bleed in ways that would not leave scars visible to strangers. She had survived the early glare, the first great love, the first public unmaking, and then made herself again, quieter, sharper, truer. The rise then was not just ascent, it was an education in how to hold the light without letting it blind you. It prepared her for the next chapter, the one where success would share a house with longing, where Nashville would lace itself through Hollywood, where music and film would attempt a duet that could either become a hymn or a howl. She did not yet know which it would be. She only knew that she was ready to try.
At first, it felt like resurrection. After the long, silent ache of her first marriage, Nicole Kidman found herself standing in sunlight again, not on a film set, but under the open sky of Tennessee, where the air smelled of guitars and freedom. Keith Urban arrived not like a storm, but like music carried on the wind, charming, broken, full of rhythm and risk. She met him in 2005 at a gathering of Australians in Los Angeles, and there was something familiar about him, a fellow traveler, another soul who had walked through loneliness disguised as a pause. He looked at her the way no one had in years, not as an actress, not as a symbol, but as if she were human again. That look can make even the most guarded heart forget the lessons it once learned in pain. Within a year, she was walking down an aisle in Sydney, her hand trembling in his. The photographs captured grace, faith, redemption. Hollywood called it the redemption romance. Nashville called it the perfect pair. But only they knew the truth, that both of them were running. Keith was running from his addictions. Nicole was running from the silence of the past. Together, they mistook motion for healing. For a while, it worked. They built a home of warmth and laughter. 2 daughters, Sunday and Faith, laughter echoing through the walls. She took time off from film, learning to cook, to garden, to breathe again. He sang her name into songs. She called him her great love. It was real as anything can be when 2 wounded hearts try to heal each other. But fame doesn't sleep, and neither does the hunger that built them both. Nicole's world was scripts and sets. Keith's world was stages and spotlight haze. They loved each other across time zones, whispered affection through phone static, and shared intimacy in the intervals between departures. In interviews, she said, "We're like 2 gypsies chasing different moons." She smiled when she said it, but her eyes told another story, the story of a woman balancing motherhood, artistry, and the unspoken fear that love might evaporate in distance. Keith, for all his tenderness, carried ghosts of his own. The road was his home and his enemy. Fame amplified his loneliness, and music, that old medicine, sometimes came mixed with poison. There were nights when Nicole sat alone in their Nashville mansion, the house too large, the clocks too loud, wondering which version of love was true, the one she saw on stage or the one that trembled in silence beside her bed. Still, she believed. Belief was her religion. She attended his shows, smiled for cameras, and became the portrait of unwavering grace. To the world, they were proof that love could survive the glare of celebrity. To Nicole, they were a promise she refused to let die. When she won new roles, Big Little Lies, Lion, Being the Ricardos, he cheered from afar, his voice thick with pride. When his albums went platinum, she stood in the crowd, tears hiding behind her applause. But beneath the applause lay an echo. Success did not silence solitude. It only made it harder to confess. Fame became their third partner, seductive, relentless, always between them. Every smile had to be camera ready. Every argument had to be erased before breakfast. Every wound had to heal before the red carpet. It was survival through performance, a duet of masks. In quieter moments, she'd lie awake beside him and remember her father's words. Strength is learning how to rebuild. But she was tired of rebuilding, tired of the beautiful ruins they kept pretending were still homes. Once, during an interview, she was asked, "What keeps your marriage strong?" She hesitated, then said softly, "Forgiveness. Endless forgiveness." Forgiveness became her art form. She forgave the tours, the absences, the headlines. She forgave herself for staying quiet, for believing that love alone could cure the ache of incompatibility. But there were signs, small, brittle fractures in the porcelain surface. A missed anniversary, a nervous smile in a photo, a lyric that felt too honest. Fame magnifies what the heart tries to hide. And still she carried on, because leaving again felt like failure, and she had already survived one public heartbreak. She would not let the world make her tragedy its entertainment twice. In 2020, during the pandemic, their world slowed. Isolation forced them to share space that had once been softened by distance. Without the rhythm of travel, the silences grew teeth. The little misunderstandings became cliffs. Keith sought music. Nicole sought meaning. Their languages no longer aligned. He wrote songs about redemption. She read poetry about release. And somewhere between the chords and the verses, they began to drift apart. But she would not speak of it. She believed in dignity, in protecting not just herself, but the man she had loved. She told friends, "You can love someone deeply and still know it's over." When the divorce papers came in 2025, the world gasped, but Nicole didn't. She had already mourned it in private long before ink met paper. The fame that once crowned her had now become a mirror she no longer needed to look into. For the first time, she didn't care about optics or headlines. She cared only about breathing, about finally stepping out of the performance of happiness and into the truth of solitude. For nearly 2 decades, she had lived as half of a symphony. Now, she would learn to sing alone again. And as the last flash bulbs faded, she whispered, not to the press, not to him, but to herself, "I don't need the world to know my side. I just need to hear my own voice again."
Every love story has a shadow, a quiet, invisible twin that grows stronger as the light grows brighter. Nicole Kidman had lived long enough to know this truth, but still, she hoped the shadow would remain small. It didn't. It began in whispers, not the kind that leaked to tabloids, but the ones you hear in your own heart. Keith's life on the road had always been loud, full of music, crowds, noise. Yet when the concerts ended, the silence inside him grew unbearable. He sought comfort in the old companions that had once nearly destroyed him: addiction, exhaustion, self-doubt. Nicole, who had spent her life learning to fix what breaks, thought she could rescue him. Love, she believed, could save anyone. But love isn't always a cure. Sometimes it's the thing that keeps you sick longer. Night after night, she waited for his calls. Sometimes they came, sometimes they didn't. The excuses were kind at first: rehearsals, delays, exhaustion. Then they became defenses. "You don't understand the pressure," he'd say, his voice frayed by distance. She'd reply softly, "I understand too well." In truth, they were speaking 2 different languages, one of melody, one of silence. There were interventions, promises, tears that soaked hotel pillows thousands of miles apart. Keith entered rehab more than once. Each time, Nicole stood by him, in public, unshaken, the image of loyalty. But behind closed doors, the strain began to show. She had spent years being someone's calm,
someone's anchor, someone's grace, and in giving that much, she had quietly lost her own gravity. She learned to smile through panic, to walk red carpets knowing he might not show up, to give interviews about love while her heart trembled behind her ribs. The world saw devotion, only she saw depletion. Friends noticed the fatigue behind her eyes. They asked if she was okay. She would answer, "I'm just tired." But what she meant was, "I'm disappearing." The tragedy wasn't betrayal, it was erosion, a slow, invisible wearing away of self. There was one night she never spoke of publicly, a night that marked the quiet breaking point. She had flown to join him mid-tour, believing they could fix what fame had fractured. When she arrived, he was distant, jittery, lost behind a wall she couldn't climb. The music that had once bound them now filled the air like static. She asked, gently, "Are you happy?" He didn't answer. He just stared at the floor, his guitar still humming from the song he hadn't finished. That silence said everything. She went to bed alone that night, staring at the ceiling, realizing that sometimes the cruelest kind of loneliness is lying beside someone you love. Days turned into months. They tried therapy, prayer, vacations that felt more like rehearsals for peace. There were small recoveries, followed by long relapses, not always chemical, sometimes emotional. He was fighting demons, she was fighting the feeling of becoming one. When their daughters asked, "Why Daddy seems sad?" she told them gently, "Sometimes grown-ups need to find their light again." She said it with a smile, but her voice cracked on light. By the time the papers were filed, the decision wasn't made in anger, it was made in mercy, for both of them. The public saw the headlines. Nicole Kidman and Keith Urban split after 19 years. Commentators speculated, gossip hosts feasted, fans mourned. But the truth was simpler, sadder, quieter. Their marriage had not collapsed in a storm, it had faded in fog. Nicole didn't expose him to humiliate, she exposed herself to heal. In her first statement after the divorce, she said, "There's no villain here, only two people who tried very hard to keep love alive." Yet there were nights she cried until morning, not because of the end, but because of the memory of how beautiful it once was. She replayed their laughter, the smell of his guitar strings, the way he once whispered songs against her shoulder. Love doesn't die with the relationship, it lingers like perfume on a scarf, haunting and tender. The tragedy wasn't the loss of Keith Urban, it was the realization that Nicole had built a sanctuary for everyone but herself. For years she had been wife, mother, muse, savior. But who had been Nicole? When she looked in the mirror, she saw 1,000 reflections. Actress, mother, humanitarian, global icon, and yet the quiet girl from Sydney stared back, asking softly, "Do you remember me?" She did. Finally. The day the divorce became public, she walked out of her Nashville home with no entourage, no designer shield, just sunglasses and a white dress that fluttered like a flag of surrender, not to defeat, but to truth. The paparazzi shouted questions. What happened? Did he cheat? Are you angry? She said nothing. The silence was her answer, and it was louder than any headline. Later, in a rare interview, she was asked if she believed in love after everything. She smiled, that small, knowing smile the world has seen 1,000 times on screen, and said, "Of course I do. I just know now that love isn't meant to save you, it's meant to teach you." That is the tragedy and the triumph, because in losing him, she found the one person she had been missing all along, herself. And as she walked away from the ashes of a 19-year story, she didn't look back. Not because she was ungrateful, but because she had finally understood. You can love someone deeply and still need to leave to stay alive. The world expected a scandal. It always does. When a woman leaves, it demands a villain. But Nicole Kidman did not give them one. She gave them silence. Then, slowly, she gave them truth. The truth wasn't explosive. It was surgical. It cut clean, without spectacle, without smoke. In her first in-depth interview after the divorce, she didn't mention Keith's name in bitterness or blame. Instead, she said quietly, "I stayed too long in silence. Sometimes love asks for your voice, not your sacrifice." That was all it took. The words traveled like wildfire through the press, not because they were scandalous, but because they were unmistakably real. For decades, Nicole had been the master of containment, the poised queen of control. Every expression calibrated, every answer refined. But now her words were unscripted, raw, almost trembling. It was as if she'd finally stepped out from behind a curtain she'd been holding up her whole life. She spoke of womanhood, of patience turned poison, of the pressure to perform happiness in front of an audience that mistakes grace for contentment. People think endurance is love, but sometimes it's fear of being unloved if you stop pretending. She didn't expose Keith, she exposed the illusion, the one every woman who has ever loved too deeply will recognize. The illusion that loyalty can heal what truth cannot. For the first time, she told the world that during her marriage, she forgot how to hear herself think. She said, "You become a mirror, reflecting someone else's light until one day you realize you've disappeared from the glass." Her words struck like quiet thunder. They weren't aimed at one man. They were an indictment of a culture that teaches women to fold themselves smaller in the name of devotion. She described how she learned to reclaim solitude, to make it sacred again. Mornings in Nashville turned into rituals of rediscovery. She'd walk barefoot through her garden, letting the dew soak her feet, whispering to the sky, "I'm still here." In her studio, she began journaling daily, not as the actress, not the wife, but the girl from Sydney who once feared invisibility. She filled pages with fragments. Freedom tastes like breathing without asking permission. Peace isn't quiet, it's clarity. Love doesn't always end, it sometimes transforms. And as she wrote, the ache softened. The woman who once believed love must be earned began to believe instead that love must be honest, even when honesty means goodbye. When a journalist pressed her for details, was there betrayal? She smiled sadly. Every marriage has betrayals. Some are of trust, some are of the soul. It wasn't an accusation, it was confession disguised as wisdom. Keith Urban, for his part, released a song months later, a ballad of regret, longing, and gratitude. The lyrics were veiled, but listeners heard the echo of her in every verse. "You were the calm I couldn't keep, and I'm still learning how to breathe where you used to be." Nicole never commented on it. She didn't need to. Some stories are better left between the hearts that lived them. What she did speak about, though, was freedom. Not the kind sold in self-help books, the kind that feels like finally living without apology. She began producing more films, championing women's voices, creating space for stories that reflected her own rebirth. Her performances deepened, glowed differently, less as a portrayal, more as embodiment. On set, she told a young actress, "You don't have to suffer to be great. You just have to be honest." It was her new mantra. When the headlines called her fearless, she laughed softly. "Fearless? No. I'm terrified, but I walk anyway." That's the hidden truth. Courage isn't absence of fear, it's refusal to be ruled by it. People expected her to remarry, to chase youth, to reinvent herself again for the public's hunger. But Nicole's transformation wasn't cosmetic, it was internal, invisible, the kind that doesn't need validation. She stopped chasing perfect endings. She started chasing authentic beginnings. For the first time in her life, she lived without an audience, and in that quiet, she discovered a deeper music. one that didn't need a stage, a partner, or applause. Years earlier, she had said she feared becoming invisible. Now she said, invisibility can be beautiful when it means belonging to yourself. That line went viral, but she didn't write it for virality. She wrote it for survival. Hollywood loves a comeback, but Nicole Kidman didn't come back. She came home. Not to a house, not to a man, but to herself. And when she finally looked in the mirror, the reflection no longer frightened her. It wasn't the wife, the mother, the icon, or the savior staring back. It was simply Nicole, the woman who had walked through devotion and despair, through fame and fracture, and emerged whole. When asked what she would tell her younger self, she paused for a long time, then whispered, "You don't have to keep proving you're worthy of love. You already are." That is the truth she had been hiding, not from the world, but from herself. And now, it was free. She no longer stands in the glare of flashbulbs. She walks through it, unbothered, unblinded. The air around her feels different now, thinner, lighter, more alive. No longer a woman rehearsing perfection, but one living in peace with her own imperfections. When she appears at premieres, people still whisper her name with reverence, but she doesn't need it. She smiles, not because she must, but because she can. The smile of a woman who has seen heaven, walked through hell, and learned that both exist within the same heart. She speaks little now about love, fame, or loss. When asked about the divorce, she answers with gentleness. It wasn't the end of love, it was the end of illusion. And with that, she disarms the world again, not through shock, but through simplicity. At home in Nashville, she keeps her life quieter than ever. The mornings are sacred. Coffee steaming against misted glass, sunlight spilling across piano keys. Her daughters are growing, her career thriving, but what matters most are the moments in between. The silence that used to terrify her now feels like a friend. Some evenings she walks outside barefoot, the grass cool beneath her feet, the stars endless above. She no longer asks what went wrong, she asks instead, what was learned? Once, she was the girl who feared becoming invisible. Then she became the woman the world could not stop watching. Now, she's something rarer. Someone who doesn't need to be seen to exist. Her story is not a tragedy. It is a rebirth. A woman who once built her life around others has now built a life around truth. And in that truth, there is no bitterness, only clarity. Because the end of a marriage is not the end of love, it's the evolution of it. Because silence is not weakness, it's wisdom. Because survival, when done with grace, becomes art. As she said once, looking straight into the camera, her voice calm and steady, "Some stories end in heartbreak. Mine began again with honesty." And with that, Nicole Kidman turned the page, not to escape her past, but to own it. No villains, no heroes, just a woman who finally remembered her own name and spoke it out loud.